Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the video recording of Webinar 3, Science-Based Targets of the Local Government Energy Saver Program. Unfortunately, our live webinar couldn't go ahead due to some technical issues, but we hope you find this video version just as informative. The webinar today, or this video, will run for around about an hour and a half. Obviously, you can't ask questions because this is a recording, and you'll be able to access this recording via YouTube shortly. Just to recap, the Local Government Energy Saver Program has had 3 webinars. We're at webinar 3 today, Science-Based Targets, and you'll see the previous 2 there are now available on YouTube via those links. Just to recap, the Local Government Energy Saver Program is a state government funded program working with 22 resource-constrained regional councils to benchmark their greenhouse gas emissions, look at some strategies and some actions they can take to reduce those emissions, and then actually move forward and make some investments in some emissions reduction and energy efficiency or renewable energy capital works programs. As part of the Local Government Energy Saver Program, these webinars are part of it, but we are also running a carbon accounting training program that's going to commence in October or November of this year. SV is partnered with Point Advisory to deliver this training program, and we have an expression of interest Eventbrite link running at the moment. So if you're interested in participating in this carbon accounting training program to give you the full background and fundamental skills that you need to be an up-to-date carbon accountant, please follow that link and register your interest, and we'll come back to you with some more information as it comes to hand. So just before we get into Ironbark's presentation, here is some hard numbers, if you like, on what science-based targets actually mean for councils. The information in these 2 histograms has been created by Ironbark for each of the councils who have participated in the Local Government Energy Saver Program so far. The histogram on the left shows the annual equivalent carbon dioxide emission reductions required to meet the percentage emissions reduction target that you'll see in the right-hand histogram, which are science-based and aligned with the Paris Agreement on limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees, hence the link to take 2 there. So you can see there's a range there of percentage reductions for science-based targets for councils, ranging from somewhere in the 70% range to around the 20% range. Some of those really large differences there are mainly attributable to the council in question running a large regional landfill and being their corporate emissions, including emissions from that landfill. Whereas smaller councils who export their waste out of their shire to a neighbouring shire's municipal landfill obviously aren't accounting for those emissions in their corporate greenhouse gas inventory. A very topical conversation piece on emissions from landfill, and I think poses more questions for us to think about finding answers to in the future. So today's webinar, we'll be talking about everything targets, where we've been, where we're going, with a focus on science-based targets. We have Alexi Lynch and Hannah Snape from Ironbark Sustainability to share with us their knowledge. Of course, I forgot to introduce myself as well again. I'm Tom Brown from Sustainability Victoria. And later on, towards the end of the webinar video, we will be having 2 guest presentations, one from Jane Spence, the City of Stonnington, to share Stonnington City's journey in carbon reduction and target setting, and also a presentation from Beck Lamble from East Gippsland Shire, calling in from Bairnsdale to talk about their progress and process in setting their own corporate emissions reduction targets. So that's it from me for now. I'll pass over to Ironbark to deliver their presentation. She'll just take a moment.
Thanks, Tom. I can get started as that moves backwards. Back in time. We're about to go back in time. Okay, science-based targets. We're going to go back in time. We're going to look at some program alignment and how the concept of science-based targets aligns with some of the state-based and global programs that are out there and international protocols as well. Traditional drivers for council targets, the types of targets that are out there, what the Paris Accord has to do with all of this, then some Australian local government carbon budgets, communicating targets. And we were going to keep it informal and see if anyone wanted to bring up any questions throughout, but that won't be able to be done. However, we're more than happy to take questions post-webinar. So if you're writing them down as you're watching this, feel free to just shoot an email through, I guess, to Tom or ourselves. Happy to collate them and send them through in another quick video or just write a quick doco. And we're also encouraging people to disagree if need be. This is sort of a contested area. There's a lot of new concepts in regards to science-derived targets, and so quite happy to hear and see and hear other opinions. Okay, you probably saw some of these slides before, which might have given away the punchlines, but if we go back to the 80s, Australia and the world were looking at emissions reduction targets through the Toronto target, which was a 20% reduction of 1988 levels by 2050. So we wanted to reduce emissions to 80%. Australia was looking at adopting these targets and possibly did. It's a bit challenging to try and find exactly what happened way back then, but Cabinet Minister Graham Richardson put forward these targets under what was known as the no regrets strategy, which meant we were going to try and meet these targets as long as it wasn't going to have an impact on the economy and other bits and pieces. So probably things sounding a little bit familiar there. Treasurer Paul Keating actually, I understand, had a bit to play in quashing that policy. And at the 1990 election, the then Liberal Party opposition actually went to the federal election with a stronger emissions targets than the Labor Party. State-based targets were adopted in the 80s. New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria. In 1988, all adopted variations of the Toronto target and even broader ones. So a lot has changed since 1988. That's a long time ago. We had the bicentennial, I think that was, and some things stayed the same. If we fast forward to 2006, not that long ago, the world mourned the death of James Brown. The world possibly celebrated the death of that guy. John Howard was our Prime Minister, and at a federal and an international level, we had two main countries that we were familiar with, Australia and the US, who were not going to sign the Kyoto Protocol. At the same time, however, there were local, regional, international council programs where councils were absolutely killing it and leading the way when it comes to emissions reduction, not dissimilar to what is happening today. Bearing in mind we've got some leading state programs that are also out there across the country. So in 2006, 240 odd councils had emissions reduction targets, more than we have today, and scattered throughout the country, representing 84% of the population, which is pretty incredible. This is for corporate, organisation-wide and broader community or municipal targets. Who met their reduction targets?
Maybe a couple.
Maybe a couple, okay. What do you reckon, Hannah?
Yeah, I'll say 3 or 4.
You'll say 3 or 4? Okay. So the answer is 0. We happy to be correct on that. If your council was one of those 240 and you say, hang on a minute, we met our target, email us and we will print a retraction and an apology. We're not referring to those that have offset. We're actually talking about emissions reduction targets. Obviously, quite a few councils are carbon neutral, having purchased offsets for their residual emissions. We think Yarra came the closest, so they had a 30% reduction target on 2008 by 2015, and they just missed it, which is a pretty impressive effort considering during that time they had a new leisure centre, which is a significant increase in energy use and emissions, and also a fair bit of growth. So you'd think they'd be congratulated on that, but of course this was the response. Not long after that in the Victorian daily newspaper. Okay, so targets align really well at the moment, especially science-based targets, with some of the leading programs that are out there. So Take 2, which is the state government's program, which is around 2 degrees. And a science-based target essentially means that you want to hit science, which is reducing climate change or global warming by 2 degrees or even less than that. Tom, am I right there in suggesting that that's what Take Two means and it's science-based?
Absolutely, Lex. So the Victorian Government has created Take Two as part of its state emissions reduction target of zero net emissions by 2050.
Yep.
Take Two is that play on the words of trying to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees. And that's exactly what science-based targets are built around, as a justifiable and defensible emissions yardstick about making sure everyone can understand what their fair share of emissions reduction is, if as a global community we're going to meet our commitment to limiting global warming to 2 degrees. And as you'll hear later from some of our council guest speakers, a science-based target has been a useful yardstick about not just saying sort of what's the minimum to do, but actually realising that it would be quite feasible to do a lot more locally.
Great, thank you. The other international program that's out there, and I know that there's a fair bit of work and alignment between SV and ICLEI Oceania, is the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, which is an international program where basically, as we touched on some of these things in the first webinar, the international protocols and programs, but basically we've got the leading international local government climate organisations getting together to develop a program. And one of the key parts of that program at the moment is that you need to develop and register a greenhouse gas reduction target. The traditional drivers for councils setting targets, this is looking back, say, at all those 240 in 2006 and in the ensuing 12 years, has essentially been the budget to reduce emissions, it's support from high levels within council. So if you've got senior management, directors, CEOs who are really gung-ho on this, that certainly assists in setting targets. The available abatement, having council officers who are pushing hard as well. Data, what's happening at the other levels of government, so state and federal. Having councillors that are keen on communicating how strong they are when it comes to targets, and being pushed by the community. So certainly over time we've seen community organisations push and seek councils to set higher targets. This is what we've always sort of said and thought, certainly at Ironbark, and I should mention that those 240 odd councils and the aforementioned Cities for Climate Protection program I was heavily involved in at the time, so was involved in setting of these targets and kind of thought that, well, they're the drivers. But looking back in hindsight, I think the traditional driver has really just been licking the finger and testing the wind a bit. And when we see targets that are 20% by 2020 or sort of aligned with Kyoto, 20% by 2012, 2013, it's probably a fair bit of guesswork that's going in when we get those really nice round numbers. Today, some research that we did with ICLEI and Beyond Zero Emissions and a survey that was put out to councils around Australia. We think we've got a pretty good take on where things are at, which is about 80% of councils around Australia have corporate targets, so internal emissions. Probably about half that have community. So this was responses from over 100 councils that we received. That's a report that's available online and has more information on that you can download for free. This is consistent with what we've heard and seen whenever we're testing the temperature or asking councils over the last 7 or 8 years. So there are a lot that still have corporate targets, but a lot less now that have community targets.
It's a great story there, and what sort of rings true to me is that there's traditionally, as you said, it's been maybe more of a dip your toe in the water and test about, let's just put a target up there that we think's about right.
Yep.
I guess to me what the silver lining to that is even though that target may or may not be achievable, there's still a really strong message there of corporate support for strong action on reducing carbon.
Yep.
So, I think they can be as valid as a science-based target.
Yep.
Yeah,
absolutely. And we'll get onto those sort of aspirational targets a bit. They have a place and they can be very valuable. I think a lot of it is just recognising and being quite explicit in the type of target that you have as the whole sector has become a bit more sophisticated around these things. And some of the traditional barriers to setting targets has been the opposite, I guess, of those sort of drivers, if you like. So leadership, lack of data, funding. And again, this is just from various surveys that we've undertaken over the last 5 or 10 years. Okay. Different types of targets. Traditionally, we've had net versus per capita. So per capita emissions just means that, we're going to incorporate the growth that we've got. CO2 versus CO2e, so whether we're looking at broader greenhouse gases or just carbon dioxide. Fewer councils have renewable energy and energy efficiency targets, and some have various guises of carbon neutrality or zero targets, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And if you've got that little NCOST sticker, it means that not only have you set the target, but you've met it and it's been third-party verified. So you've offset your residual emissions through accredited providers. So this is, I guess, where we get into the guts of what a science-based or science-derived target is. And I guess we can use the language interchangeably there, based versus derived. The reason we've used the term derived is because science-based targets is actually the name of an organisation and a thing.
Okay.
So it's generally more catered towards corporates and businesses. And so we're, I guess, trying to differentiate that this is really around local governments, and the difference is that we're talking community-wide, things that councils might not necessarily have control over. If you're a big multinational or Australian business, then you've got control over your emissions and you can have a science-based target, trademarked, whatever it might be. Science-derived targets, we're talking about community as a whole, so residential, commercial, ways to transport coming in and out of your municipality, not just what you own and operate. And if the answer is no to those, then you've got an aspirational target. So you're not looking at what the science is saying top down, and you're not looking at what your action plan is saying, which is, if we're going to implement all of these things, this is the exact target that we're going to meet. Really good analogy we've got here, which is around levels of mercury. So this is an aspirational target. The targets that have been out there up until now, really just social and political constructs to give you something to strive for. So by 2020, the levels of mercury in our water supply are going to be 0. That sounds pretty aspirational to me. It's not bad. It's just being clear on what the role is, and it can motivate stakeholders. And as you mentioned, Tom, aspirational targets have been really successful in bringing people, councils, community groups behind a common unifying place. It is good at unifying action, and it can be set with very little or no understanding of what the challenge is, which again can be quite handy if you want to do something quickly. And communicating targets and communicating climate change and what needs to be done is quite important, and is in itself its own little area of science, which we'll touch on later on. It's not very good at assessing the efficacy of what you're doing though, because you're just sort of going, oh yeah, 0 by 2020 sounds about right. You don't know whether that's actually what's required, and you don't know whether that's what you said you were going to do or what you needed to do.
So, Lex, that would be one of the bigger risks with an aspirational target is it could be quite hard to defend. Why?
Yeah.
Why are you setting this target?
Those aforementioned 240 odd councils that missed or didn't miss, some would have copped a bit of flack about it. We saw that the one that got closest copped the most flack, probably for political reasons, but the rest of them, there wasn't much of an understanding of how or why. Sometimes it was, we're aligning with what the Kyoto goals are, even though Australia hadn't signed. Others were, it kind of sounds nice.
Yep.
So the top-down or the science-derived target. So this is a target set by an external limit or independent research. And this is really interesting, and we've spent a lot of time looking into these in the last 12 months, and we love them. So here's an example. Mercury levels must be below 2 parts per billion, or people are going to start to get sick. That's what the science says, or something along those lines. Don't quote us on the 2 parts per billion. Don't start putting mercury in the water. Here's another example. If a modern submarine dives further than 730 metres, the hull will collapse due to pressure. That's what the science says. The science doesn't actually care whether your target is 1 or 3 parts per billion for mercury. The science doesn't care if you're submarine and you've got a target of getting to 900 metres, because regardless of what you say, that's what's going to happen to your submarine if you don't meet the target.
So the importance of that is that those figures there, or that science figure, you can't debate those. They can't change. They're a fixed constant.
Yep.
And it's
Yep, so we can, the science will look at perhaps whether, better submarines mean you can get further down than 730, so that changes, or we've figured that humans are suddenly becoming resistant to mercury, and so the exact 2 parts per billion changes, but it's been driven by what's happening externally. We're not the experts on the science. We get told what the science says, and we say, well, that's what we need to meet. And you wouldn't muck around with trying to go more than 730 metres if you were down in a submarine, because that's what the science says. It's an external target that really doesn't care what you think or what you set. So it's really good at providing that hard limit, and we'll get into how it relates to carbon budgets and climate change. So it's good at establishing the minimum performance requirements of action taken. What it's bad at, or what we're not sure yet, is that whether it's a motivating for action. So whether talking about science-based targets is actually going to motivate people. I imagine it's going to motivate people when it comes to submarines. When it comes to climate change, because of all the politics and the cultural divide, we're not really sure yet. It's also not good at assessing the efficacy of the program. So whether you're actually getting there or not, it's just saying if you breach this, there's going to be certain consequences. And finally, the bottom-up target, which is based on estimates of what can be achieved from what you're implementing. So this could still be, an ambitious plan, but essentially it's looking at all the things that you're going to put in place and where it's going to get to. So if we're going to do all these things to reduce mercury, we're going to reduce levels to below 1 part per billion. From a climate point of view, it might be that we're going to change our street lights, we're going to put energy efficiency on certain buildings, we're going to do solar, we're going to do electric vehicles. It's going to cost 500 grand and it's going to reduce our emissions by 23.6%. You can get an idea about what everything you're going to do is going to actually impact on. And so it can provide guidance on the impact of your action plans. It's really good at assessing the efficacy of what you're doing. But again, it doesn't necessarily show whether you're meeting a required target. It's not automatically linked to that top-down or science-derived. And as far as motivating stakeholders, not really sure. I'm sure there's a lot of people that will have opinions on that out there. The way they interact, so the top-down target provides content and scale for bottom-up, what you're planning on doing, and sets what should be a minimum allowable level for your aspirational target. And ideally, your aspirational target would be higher than your bottom-up target. But there's a little bit of more nuanced interplay between those three things. Okay, what does Paris have to do with this? So, Tom, you touched on it a little bit earlier as far as the international processes. Paris has a lot to do with this because central to the Paris Agreement are some items that are of a lot of importance to Australian councils. The first is how Australian councils do set localised targets that are now in line with what the international community has said. So 2 degrees and 1.5, which is I'll get the language wrong here, but not aspirational. What's the language around the?
I can't remember. I always thought of it as aspirational as well,
yep.
But.
Yep. So there's 2 degrees is considered the minimum, and 1.5 is where we want to get to. The second important part is that it explicitly recognises and engages local and subnational governments, which is pretty important for councils around the world, and it means that there's much more of a stronger advocacy position for councils and state governments to push what's happening at a federal and international level.
And so if I can just
please
add in again there. So harking back to take 2 again, Lex has mentioned there of subnational governments' connection to the national government's agreement at Paris. Take 2 here in Victoria is Victoria's vehicle to try and bring together both local governments, state agencies, individuals, business and industry, all together in Victoria to, as a state, contribute to meeting a subnational agreement on carbon reduction, which in Victoria is looking to be net zero emissions in Victoria by 2050.
Great. And 2 degrees, which is it was before Paris, it was accepted as emerged as a sort of tipping point beyond which we would have dangerous runaway climate change. And between the three of us, haven't got the language quite right, but there's whatever it says in the Paris Accord is that we're striving to actually reach 1.5 degrees.
Limit 1.5 degrees.
Limit, that's right. We're not going to try and get as high as we can, are we? That wouldn't be very smart. So the way this is done is that there's the IPCC essentially has developed a carbon budget. So the total amount of carbon that would cause global temperatures to breach that 2 degree mark or the 1.5 degree mark. This is contestable in as far as the actual amount and what 2 degrees means. So there'll be a lot of people out there saying 2 degrees isn't enough and it should be 1.5 or it should be less than 1.5. Just as, on the margins, what that carbon budget is. But the whole point of the IPCC is that we've got all of the scientists coming together and coming out with a consensus idea about what we need and what we want. So it's also acknowledging that the actual, numbers on the margins could change.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example of that.
Lex, just for those who perhaps aren't as close to carbon accounting, the IPCC is
the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate
Change.
There we go.
Yeah, and their main role?
Their main role is it's a group of scientists from around the world, and the main scientific bodies from around the world, and please jump in here because I'm not a scientist, that work to determine whether climate change is real, which 10, 15, 20 years ago pretty clearly determined that it was unequivocally happening, and then what we need to do to actually stop it. So it comes under the United Nations framework.
Okay.
And yeah, I'm not too sure on the interplay between how they all work. Hannah,
I just know them as an international research body on climate change, the authority, and they release the assessment reports every however many years. Is it 3 years?
I think it is. Yeah.
Yeah, they give you all the latest science, all the latest numbers on climate change.
Yeah. So they are the Earth's authority on climate change, and through international collaboration, that's how the panel has determined how much carbon we can put into the atmosphere and the subsequent flow-on impacts to our ecological systems.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'm sure Google can find a better way of explaining it than we just did. You got me there. Intergovernment, the IPCC, Google IPCC. It's where you go for the authority on climate, and it's the literally thousands of scientists and scientific institutions around the world who come together and put their imprimatur on what we need to do and where we're at.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Lex.
That's right.
And Hannah?
Okay, so we've got a budget. We've got a certain amount of carbon that we need to not release, otherwise we're going to hit a 2 degrees increase. And we've got a little bit less information on what it would mean for a 1.5 degrees increase for various reasons. But essentially, there's a global budget. So the IPCC has said 1,701 gigatons of CO2. That's how much, if we start breaching that amount, then we're getting into territory of dangerous and irreversible climate change. We don't have questions, do we?
No.
What Australia has done, along with other countries, is started developing localised carbon budgets based on their fair share of emissions. So the Australian Climate Change Authority and Climate Works have been heavily involved in this as well, said that our nationally determined contribution, if you like, is 10.1 gigatons. And again, I'm a little bit fuzzy with the terms at the international level, so I apologise for that. But what we do know is that the Australian Climate Change Authority said we've got 10.1 gigatons of CO2. That's the budget for Australia.
So between 2000 and 2050, Australia as a nation, its component of the global emissions cap is 10.1 gigatons.
Correct. Between 2013 and 2050.
Right. Thanks for that.
So there is a lot of work. This is just a high level figure. So as you can probably appreciate, there are, hundreds of thousands of documents and hours that go into developing what it means and what a fair share means from nation to nation, etc. But this is what was recommended by our main authority. It was 10.1 gigatons. And so we can then look at how this gets scaled to council, municipal areas. So City of Moreland, I think, was one of the first to do this, where they just based it on population. So there's the 10.1 gigatons. and the population of Moreland is 130,000, 140,000, I'm not sure, whatever it might be. Basically, you look at whatever the population of the municipality is, divided by 24 million people in Australia, multiplied by that budget, and you say, that's our share based on population. So probably at its simplest, that'd be a way to do it and say, this is our science-based target. When at the start we talked about how contestable it is, like it's worth noting that the federal government, for example, will say that their 26 to 28% target by 2030 is based on the science, and certainly that is heavily contested. A lot of people will disagree with that. So, yeah, this is probably what we would certainly consider to be best practice from all the research that we've done on this. So the first thing is you scale it to population, and you get...
So be your per capita measure?
Yep. So for example, we've got this global budget, a lot, and then we scale it to Australia. Now you'll see that's 8.5 because we've churned through a lot in the last 5 years, and that 10.1 is down to 8.5. One of our colleagues, Matt Sullivan, likes to, I think, keep a daily update on what the Australian budget is. But as of June 2018, it's about 8.5 gigatons. And so then you could scale it according to population to say, well, based on our proportion of the population, here's our budget. So my town, we've made this one up, 36,000 kilotons of CO2. That's how much we've got. We can't use any more of that. What we also do, though, is take it a little bit further and incorporate other scaling factors, because just basing it on population, we think, is a little bit unfair. And just like at an international level, we look at fairness and the ability of different countries to increase or reduce emissions.
Yep.
We can do the same thing at a local and regional level. So the other thing that we do is we scale it for growth. So if you're in a local government area that is expected to have your emissions increasing, then you get a larger budget. If you've got a declining rate base and or that your emissions are, supposedly are going to go down, then you get a smaller share of the budget. And likewise, we apply scaling factors from CEFA, which is the socioeconomic indicators for areas. I hope I get that one right. And again, this is I guess a proxy for ability to reduce emissions. And so CEFA is looking at the highest and lowest, the most advantaged or disadvantaged council areas developed by the ABS. And so what we can do is say those that are high on the CEFA scaling, or those that are the most advantaged councils, if you like, receive a lesser amount of budget, and those that are more disadvantaged receive a little bit of a higher budget based on the ability they will have to reduce emissions. So if you're in a cashed up area, then you've got, like Australia as a cashed up country, needs to do a bigger share of the lifting.
Yep.
Here's a little graph on how that works. And so, for example, we've got two municipalities, and they're both, let's say, they have the same population and the same growth rates. They would have a carbon budget of X. Those that are the highest ranking on the CEFA index will have a new carbon budget that is less, because they should be able to reduce emissions because they have the means, the expertise and the resources to do so, whereas those that are on the lowest areas of socioeconomic indexes receive a larger carbon budget.
Which is a reduced capacity to affect change.
Exactly. Yep. And when we, again, talk about the contested nature, I guess it's more important to just understand these broader principles at this stage, because you can apportion different amounts, criteria to how you weight CEFA. Okay. And you'll get a different actual budget, which is why the governance of this becomes really important as well. So we've been working with all the greenhouse alliances and other councils now, representatives from other states, to essentially determine what the weighting and criteria is, because it will change. And this is where we look at the fact that this is going to be a little bit of a moving feast as far as what that budget is. And so don't get caught up on the numbers. It's the same with those that haven't seen the first webinar on community and corporate emissions.
Yeah.
You should definitely watch that first webinar, because it is quite linked to this. Don't get too hung up on your total community emissions profile, because it might be out by a little bit, but the concept is there, and we'll get better at determining what it is. It's the same with carbon budget calculations. We're talking about some pretty massive numbers here. And so around the edges, things might change, but we do get a bit more of an, at least it gives you an idea of the concept of how these things are developed.
Yeah, and even though we're talking about variation within a science-based target based on scaling and ranking and weightings, it's still important to recognise just how accurate a science-based target is and how defensible it is when you consider it in the context of where we've been and where we are today with carbon management.
Absolutely. Okay, so here's for an example of what a budget would look like for a council. So after it's been scaled for growth and CEFA, let's use that My Town example before. So their budget has increased. So they, for example, might have been a council that has increasing growth, and I'm talking about growth in emissions here, not just population growth, or it is a council that is more disadvantaged, and so it receives a higher amount of budget. And what you can then say is, look, here's our budget, and here's the rate of reduction that we need to reduce by as a community. And if we don't do anything within X amount of years, so in this case 24.8 years, it's all gone. So this is what we need to do to reduce it. And there are different then strategies, if you like, to look at how you can actually reduce your budget. So, and this is analogous to what happens on the international scale, where you can either look at peaking as soon as possible and having a flatter sort of reduction over time, or whether you're going to keep ramping up your emissions in the short term, and then you'll have to quickly come down because the budget will ensure that you have to. So for this graph here, the total amount below those three lines is the same. It's just a matter of how quickly or slowly you're going to start reducing. And so this is the sort of thing that nations are looking into, states are looking into, and councils can as well. I'm going to hand over to Hannah now, who's going to talk about communicating these. I'm just going to pass that over to you, Hannah.
Hannah, I might get you just to swap. Yeah, swap would be better.
Yeah, sure.
And just while Hannah's getting seated, I suppose we have to think about why we want to set a target.
Yep.
We want to set a target for a number of reasons, and so corporately speaking, it's so we have an objective measure of where we want to get to. But I think it's also important to consider how that target can be used to create change or leverage support more broadly. So hope you agree, Hannah.
Yes, definitely. And yeah, I guess that's what we'll talk about now, is now that we understand kind of where the targets come from and how we get them and what we've done, now we need to understand them and know how to talk about them. So the first thing will be that the targets are helping us to understand the scale of the challenge overall, and with community targets particularly, we then have to understand, okay, we have this huge challenge ahead of us. What are we responsible for, and how do we talk about that? So will this be challenging? Yes, it will. It's huge. Climate change isn't a small problem, and understanding our role in it can be daunting. However, everything is changing really, really quickly. We've got technology, we've got politics, we've got the grid that's all undergoing rapid changes at the moment. There's a battery revolution, there's huge residential uptake of solar. And if you don't believe that things can change very quickly, we've got these photos here of Easter morning 1900 in New York. All of these horses in just one car, compared to just 13 years later. At the moment, things are changing much, much quicker than that. And they're going to keep changing quicker and quicker. So it's huge, but everything is possible.
Can I say, in that photo there, that second photo, if you can read or not, it actually says spot horse. So 13 years later.
Can you see a horse in there, Lex?
No horses.
No horses? That's a trick.
Hold on.
Now, especially when we're looking at community targets, when we've got this huge challenge, but it's really important to draw a line of accountability. So you can change your street lights. Oh, went too far. You can change your street lights, you can manage your waste, you can put solar on, But ultimately, when you've got this community target, council is only responsible for what council can do. Council is not responsible for the entire municipality and everything that they can do. You can create an enabling environment, you can make all the changes, you can lead, but you can't ultimately be held responsible for everything and everything that everyone does. So you draw a line of accountability and you say, this is what the target is and this is what we're going to do. But that does tend to sound like a little bit of a cop-out. However, what we're not saying is that you should draw your big fat line of accountability, say what you're going to do, and then just ignore the rest. It's someone else's problem. What we do suggest is that you say, okay, we've got this big target and here's what council can do and what we can directly affect. And then we'll talk to the state government and we'll say, what are you guys doing? Okay, that's going to impact our target as well. And actions that our residents take will impact our target in this way, and industry. And then once you've added together everything, you may have a gap. You can say what's left and how are we then going to focus on changing what we're doing so that that gap is filled so that we can meet the target. Suddenly it becomes a lot more achievable, and you've got a plan for meeting it that seems achievable. It's not so scary and challenging. Now the next bit is about communicating your targets. So this has actually come about because a lot of councils that have got their targets have seen these crazy numbers and they've said, okay, we understand that's what it is. It's totally agnostic. We have to achieve this, but how are we gonna get people on board? We understand it, but no one else does. And in talking about it, you really need to be thinking about, okay, why are you explaining it? As we've heard about aspirational targets in the past, the role of those targets was to motivate and to educate. And so they necessarily had to be communicated widely. However, with a science-derived target, that is not the role that it's necessarily playing. It is a tool for budgeting, it is a tool for planning. So if you're going to communicate it, you really need to think about why you're communicating it. You need to think about who you're communicating it to. So if you're communicating it internally to fellow council officers, or if you're communicating it to councillors, or if you're communicating it through to your community, each of those is going to look really different. And then how you communicate it is key. You really need to be strategic about what you're doing. And the key is that one size does not fit all. So you need to be really, really nuanced about what you're saying and how you're saying it. As an example, we've spoken to leaders, standard councils, and those who maybe are not quite as on board. So we've got people saying climate change is our #1 priority. There is no such thing as enough. We don't want to be communicating this obscure figure. We want to get to 0 as soon as possible, and nothing less will be enough. And that's absolutely fantastic. We wouldn't be saying hold back and do less. But what you've got here is a tool for planning and a tool for budgeting. You've got a timeline within which you need to achieve something. You've got your standard council who has a lot of competing demands. They've given budget to climate change and they want to know that that's important. So you don't want to then take a science-derived target up to councillors and say, you know, that really expensive but excellent project that we did last year, that actually only achieves 0.5% of this target. You need to really think about what you're saying there. And then you've got people who just don't want to talk about climate change at all. And maybe in that case, you're not going to talk about your target, or you're going to talk about it or use it in a different way. But in each of these situations, it's really, what you do is really different and is really nuanced. And this is by any means not exhaustive at all. Now the next was to go on to Q&A.
Can we go back to that last one though? Because this is just from the last even a week or so. I think it probably requires a bit more of a discussion, because communicating targets is, and we've sort of, you know, forgive us all for putting 3 little boxes there. Obviously that's a it's a line. There are different councils that change and have different people involved, and we'll talk about climate change and emissions reduction in various ways. But as Hannah said, certainly you'll have the Darabins of this world, for example, that the way they're communicating climate change responses is climate emergency. We know we just need to do things as soon as possible, and that might and will change. Others, those that, for example, are in that bottom third area, doesn't necessarily mean that things aren't happening. So through like the Local Government Energy Savers program and some other work that we're doing with regional councils in the northwest, they won't mention climate, they won't mention greenhouse emissions, but they get a lot done, mitigation, emissions reductions, adaptation, through other ways, because they know the council laws, they know the senior management, and they know how to get things through. We're doing work in Bundaberg, where they've got the highest penetration of solar PV in the country, and it's a really low socioeconomic area. And so obviously the communication there is around energy bills and reducing costs, etc. So the nuanced nature of it is really locality specific. Whatever works for you is key. I think the other part is there are a lot of resources around there around communicating climate change. And I don't know how many people were signed up, 50 or 60 for this webinar. Yep. 50 or 60 that'll watch the video, probably thousands really. I think so. But there'll be different opinions and, arguing on climate change and arguing on how to communicate climate change has become a bit of a national pastime in this country. And there is a lot of information out there on the best ways to do so. So I'd highly recommend looking at Yale Climate Communications. The Conversation often has some really good information on how to communicate climate change and climate visuals. Obviously, there's the SV research as well. Yeah. And neither is right or wrong. So what's right for Bundaberg is not right for another area, is not right for Penrith, is not right for the community group, for example, where you want to actually talk about climate emissions, resilience and environment. Then if you're talking up the chain to the finance committee within council or council laws that are concerned about development, then you're talking about something else. If you're talking to people that are going to deny climate change, then it's more about, things are getting hotter and what about the ski fields and are we actually going to be able to eat salmon in the future? Here's how, we're going to try and make sure that everything is going to be okay for everyone in the future.
And I'm glad you brought up the social research that Sustainability Victoria has done. And if you haven't seen it yet, you can find it on Sustainability Victoria's website. But it was a piece of independent social research that was commissioned by SV. And it provides both a statewide but also a region breakdown for a snapshot in time as a representative sample of Victorians, what our attitudes are to climate change. Yep. And I think nearly everyone who reads it is quite refreshed or quite surprised by the consistency of support across all communities for action on climate change, and that sometimes there's this undertone when we're communicating on climate change that it's the minority who are on board. What our social research is actually saying to us is that it's actually more like the majority, the silent majority potentially, who are on board for action with climate change, and that I think that can be quite an important perspective to have in your head that as a society we are shifting more towards a broad spectrum support for action on climate change, and certainly in Victoria that social research is really justifying that.
So for example, Plate 2. It's actually got the words climate change in there, climate change pledge, whereas others will suggest, and again, I say this is hotly contested because there will be people that say you must talk about climate change in there. The whole point is rallying, community groups, whatever it might be. Others will talk about, the having the actual words there can often bring negative connotations to it to some people. And so it really does depend on, who you're talking to. There are examples when Richard Nixon said, "I am not a crook." Everyone just focused on the word crook, and it was immediately, plastered all over him. Yeah. Or there's a book called "Don't Think of an Elephant," which of course gets everyone thinking of elephant. So some of the evidence-based research that there's billions of dollars that goes into this, either how you can use the language to communicate things for positive outcomes, and of course there's billions of dollars of research that goes into how you can try and ruin the message and confuse the message. But I'd suggest looking into it and then using that to determine likewise how you communicate your targets as one subsector of broader climate communications.
All right. So I think we're coming towards the end of our time, but I think one question that's been burning in my mind, and hopefully it is for others, is if a council's interested in science-derived targets, you know, they've got a greenhouse gas inventory, they might have an action plan, they know roughly where they can get to. How do they take their inquiry for more information on a science-based target forward? Where do they go to for that type of information? I know it's new. Where can we direct councils to?
That's a really good question. So there is a working group that has been set up that has Victorian councils, anyway, the alliances involved. I know that this is going broader than Victoria, and we've got a few councils from other states involved too. We're facilitating that at the moment.
Okay.
Ideally, that's not how it should be longer term, which is why we want to put a bit of governance around it to determine, you know, the sort of points we mentioned before about how do you, what should be the impact on low socio-economic communities.
Yeah.
And that there are a range of other things that could be incorporated in there as well that CFA doesn't actually include.
Yeah.
So you could start, the first point of call would be to probably give us a buzz, because then we can pass you on to other councils, if you like, or regions that are working in this.
Yep.
Yeah, that's probably the first,
All
without
right.
trying to, you know.
And is there any sort of online resources, either in Australia or internationally, that talk about science-based targets?
Yeah.
That would be a reference point for councils to look at as well?
Look, there's a lot out there. I mean, I think from a council point of view,
Yep.
I'd suggest that Australia councils are leading on this. So,
Right.
you know, with the Director of Climate Change at SV, Stephanie Zurch, myself and some others were at the Resilient Cities Conference just a month or two ago, and certainly we were presenting on this, on how this is how Australian and Victorian councils are developing targets, and our colleague Matt Sullivan is in Montreal now at the ICLEI Global Congress talking about this. So I think we're leading.
Okay.
Others are sort of talking about what it means and just drawing on what organisations do, businesses, and you can Google and you'll find a lot on science-based targets and how businesses go about it,
All right.
but very little on how councils and communities go about it.
Okay. So the message that comes out from me from that is that at this point in time, communicating and collaborating with your peers, with government agencies, with leading independent thinkers like Ironbark, greenhouse alliances, is where we're at with science-based targets today. And the more we talk and the more we share, collectively we can move forward and maybe put some firmer framework around the process.
Yeah. And I think the point you brought up a little bit earlier about why I sort of mentioned that, there are things that will change along the margins as far as, is that 1,701 gigatons or is 1,702 gigatons. When I mentioned, that there will be changes around the margins, that's what I mean. As you pointed out, the broader focus that this is a science-derived target and it's not negotiable stands.
Yeah.
And I was concerned probably a year ago that this isn't really going to take off because it's a bit too much of a scary concept. Because you've got a carbon budget, basically it means that sometime soon you're going to get to zero. Every council in Victoria and Australia therefore has a zero carbon target. It's just a matter of how long you've got before all of your budget is gone. But I've been really surprised, especially through the Local Government Energy Savers program and those 22 councils that are eligible or involved, who have really taken it on board and are interested in progressing it further.
Yep.
I think possibly something that sounded scary at first just does take the heat out of it, because you don't have to discuss, well, should it be 20 or 25 or 30%? It's like, no, here's your allocation.
Yep.
And that's it. And then you can look straight, you start to move on really quickly about, your bottom up and the things that you can do. And accepting and acknowledging that there might be differences between what the science-derived target is. And obviously, I think Beck and Jane will be talking about this a bit.
Yeah. Yep.
There's some councils will say you've got a science-derived target and you've got your action up, all the things that you can do, and there's a big disconnect. That's okay. It's worth acknowledging that this is the scale of the challenge, and let's keep, reassessing and talking about it a lot. You'll have other situations where what you're doing is going to meet the targets, and that's great.
Or exceed them.
Or exceed them. That's even better, possibly down the line. And this is the work of that, the working group, is, you could possibly look at council carbon trading. If you're exceeding it and someone else isn't, you could be setting up some sort of system within, the 520 or 30 odd Australian councils.
Peer-to-peer carbon trading.
Yeah, yep.
For sure.
But I think certainly some of the key messages are, it is important to have a target, and it is important, we think, to have a science drive target so you do understand the scale of the challenge and then how far you want to actually progress that and use that language internally and externally is a bit up to you. There are a lot of really switched on local government people that say, don't use the word science outside of these walls. That's cool. That's where it becomes contested, how you use the language. But having a target also is a rallying point. It does show leadership in your community. And if there are others in the community who are getting out there saying, this is the carbon budget for our community, then council really needs to be playing their part as well. And I guess the final point is that it is something that should be reviewed frequently, so you do understand what it means for your council as things change, and the points that Hannah were making about the pace of change.
Yeah,
that's mind blowing. That the cynicism we might have around electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, and we don't know exactly what the future will hold. But 13 years, no more horses in New York City. We're now at the stage where I think Paul Hawkins said a few months ago when he was in town, we're at a point in history today where the pace of technological change has never been faster, and it is slower than it will ever be again. So the targets might seem daunting, but geez, things can happen quickly.
Yeah, great. All right. Thanks, Hannah. Thanks, Lex.
Pleasure.
We're now going to hear from our two guest council presenters, East Gippsland Shire Council and Stonington. So hang in there and we'll be back in a second. So thanks, Ironbark, for that presentation on science-derived targets, or science-based targets, I should say. So we also thought that in this webinar, it'd be really good to hear from some local governments who have actually been working busily in implementing their own greenhouse gas reduction targets of different types. There's multiple things we need to think about with greenhouse gas reduction targets. We need to think about whether they're going to be science-based or aspirational or action-driven. We need to think about securing political support. We also need to think about how we're going to implement them and track progress. So we thought it'd be good to hear from Jane Spence, the Coordinator of Environment at Stonington City, about her experience at council with their corporate emissions reduction targets. So over to you, Jane.
Okay, thanks. So it was time for us to renew our new sustainable environment strategy. So we've had targets for 2015 and for 2020. We're about to meet our 2020 target, likely early, hopefully. So due to international commitments from the Paris Agreement, developing the new strategy and the imminent achievement of our target, it was time to set a new one. So we started to look at what that might look like and got Ironbark on board and got them to help us map out our business as usual up until 2030, and then also looking at sort of the top-down approach, which was the sort of science-derived target, and then looking at bottom-up, which would be based on our energy efficiency program over the next 5 years and some of our planned initiatives, what each of those would look like. So the science-derived target was going to look like a 35% reduction on 2005 levels by 2030,
Okay.
which we feel like we're going to meet in the next couple of years. So
Wow.
we wanted to go a little bit more than that.
Sure.
So the bottom-up target is a 60% reduction on 2005 levels by 2030, which we think is actually achievable based on all of the different actions that we've already got mapped out. That also incorporated some of our big new developments over the next couple of years. We have one of council's biggest projects, which is our Cato Square redevelopment. We have a big indoor stadium coming up and a couple of others. So they were all taken into consideration. But when they say that as well, these are corporate targets, and also it's only for our energy consumption, it doesn't include waste or staff transport.
Yeah. Okay.
So sort of countering with that information.
And how was there a process that you took to say, well, we're not going to include waste or some scope 3s?
Yeah, well,
sources?
This is sort of our approach for the last couple of years. So we haven't included those, and so we wanted to, I guess, maintain consistency and that process of communicating any of those bigger changes. And I mean, it would mean that our target wouldn't be as strong, but it also means that it gives us space to start to work out how do we incorporate that. And like I think maybe a couple of other councils, we pay bills for some of our sports pavilions, but not others.
Yeah.
These targets do include our aquatic centres. I know that's not always included in some other areas. So it was sort of this process of looking at what do we have, what have we been including, and then I guess that ended up being where we were at.
Yeah.
It may change over time, but I think if we start to look, start paying bills for, it's everything that we pay bills for, essentially.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It also incorporated, based on some of the feedback from Ironbark, was increasing renewable energy into the grid, building efficiency and technology improvements, and more efficient fleets.
Okay.
So that was also factored into that as well.
Great.
And then we also were sort of thinking about what are those further opportunities. So thinking about that, getting that 60% target, there's like a whole range of street lighting projects that we can do. So we've only just started to get onto some of those. There's a whole bunch of lighting upgrades, more energy efficiency initiatives. There's a lot of HVAC work that we're going to be doing.
Okay, so we've heard quite a bit about science-based targets today, and you were saying your science-based target would have been around 35% by 2030?
Yeah.
So the motivation to go to 60% by 2030, you had the backing of some good background work on knowing what your sort of realistically achievable reduction levels were based on upcoming projects. Where did that motivation come from to say, well, we can actually do more than our science, justified amount?
Yeah.
Was that driven from a staff level or a community level or a council level, or was it a combination of things?
Very much council level, like within internally. So councils made pretty strong commitments about environment and sustainability. Environment's one of the 4 pillars of our council plan. So there has been consistently a strong commitment from council to take action. Our existing targets, I mean, we're going to meet, it looks like we're going to meet them early. So I think there's already a little bit of momentum there.
Okay.
And we have a fairly ambitious, and we're lucky we have a good budget for our energy efficiency improvements as well.
Right.
And when we looked at what we're planning on doing over just the next 5 years, then we were already going to achieve, I think even just based on that, it was going to be close to 60%. So we were already so on track with that it's not too ambitious, but it's pushing us a little bit.
Yeah.
Look, I guess the next step was we developed those targets and we took it to EMT, our executive management team.
Yep.
There was some concern around, I guess, that continued investment for 10 years.
Okay.
So there was definitely that as something that we had to talk through. But the fact that there's a whole range of, I guess, ongoing improvements in the world more generally around fleet efficiencies, building efficiencies, technology, and just the grid itself, then we were able to move through that, and based on what we're planning and what is feasible in even the short term with our street lighting program. Okay. Then we were able to lay any of those fears and then go through the council pretty smoothly, actually.
Yeah. So do you think having a like an implementation pathway for your targets was important in getting them endorsed by council? Yeah, definitely. And I guess one of the ways that we do this is we did, I guess, an energy efficiency implementation plan for 5 years, the next 5 years. Okay. So we did audits of our top 20 energy consuming sites. We looked at all of the opportunities, mapped out how much we need to spend, what we'd be saving, and then our greenhouse reductions from all of those opportunities, which helped us map out where we're going to get to over the next 5 years. Yeah. And then on top of that, doesn't incorporate, our street lighting potential as well. So that just keeps taking us down and down and down. Yeah. So yeah. And did you find, so you mapped out all your emissions potential from your actions that are coming up. Mm-hmm. Did you find having a sort of a goalpost of a science-derived target useful to say, if we can get here, this is kind of, we're doing our fair share, but we can do more? Was that a useful sort of yardstick to? Yeah, definitely. And I think it just also meant that there was, I don't know how to use the words, but it felt pretty good that we were going to go way beyond that. Okay. And I think that was really good for our councillors to understand too, that we're going really well. We're actually doing a lot of really great stuff, and we're going to, go beyond what is our fair share. And I guess our leadership within the community is a really strong motivator for where we're going as well. Okay. Yeah, we have, I guess, to some extent, our community is not so engaged in some of the things that we're doing, so that's us trying to work out how do we do that, and I suppose then the community part becomes the next step. Yeah, sure. Okay. And so in terms of that sort of formal process, it sounds like you did a lot of officer level and executive management level around quantifying your target and justifying it. You then obviously took that to council to get council endorsement. Was that a smooth process from briefing through to public meeting?
I'm trying to remember, it was a couple of weeks ago. It was only recently. Yes, it was fairly smooth. I think with EMT we were able to iron out some of those issues around the continued investment.
Okay.
And then I think we were able to get our councillors quite excited about where we're going and how we're getting there.
Yeah.
So it was a really good step for engagement, and it's part of our, for us it was a good process because it's part of, those targets form part of our new draft sustainable environment strategy,
Okay.
which we then tested with them last week and they're really excited about. So we'll now test all of this with our community. Next week, our strategy will go out for community consultation.
All right.
So then we'll get a sense of how they feel about it. But yeah, I think it's all been fairly smooth. And I think there's actually a lot of excitement and momentum now around the work that we're doing and where we're trying to go, which is really great. It's sort of been a really great engagement tool for us.
Excellent. All right. Is there anything else you want to share from your journey with carbon targets at Stonington?
No, but I'm now really curious about how we might be able to do that for our community, I suppose, and that fair share, and how we get them more engaged in the opportunities that are available and what we're doing, and how we can work together as a community with other different stakeholders, I guess.
So potentially community emissions profiling and community emission targets is your next step?
Yeah, well, we did a community emissions profile and that formed part of our strategy as well.
Okay.
We just weren't ready, I think, to create a target yet. We haven't had one in the past, and I think it might just take a little bit longer to be able to work out what does that look like for us.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jane.
Thank you.
Hello. This presentation will provide an overview from East Gippsland in terms of our greenhouse gas monitoring and reporting. So the outline of the presentation is I'll give an introduction, then an overview of how our monitoring and reporting started and the journey so far, because it does sometimes feel like a big journey. I'll then outline the energy efficiency and renewable energy actions that are being monitored and reported. So just a background on East Gippsland, we cover 10% of Victoria, but it's got a pretty small population of 45,000 people. East Gippsland is located in the far east of the state, so from Benster, which is about 3.5 hours east of Melbourne. It extends up to Omeo and the Snow in the north, and then all the way to the border of New South Wales in the far east. So we've got pretty diverse environments and resilient communities. So it includes the high country, Victorian high country, the Ramsar listed Gippsland lakes, rainforests and the old growth forests, but 80% of the region's actually in state or national parks. We've got lots of emergency events, lots of bushfires and floods. So our communities are pretty resilient, but with population increasing, we're getting lots of tree changes, so they're not necessarily used to the bushfires and the floods. I'll now quickly go through the history of our greenhouse gas monitoring and reporting program. So our monitoring program started in 2010. I was hired 2 days a week as a sustainability officer with the purpose to implement the high priority actions of the environment strategy. The strategy and tasks were set out by our local Environmental Sustainability Advisory Board. They gave many hours of their time. They had great technical knowledge. So the specific tasks that I took on included undertake a comprehensive energy and emissions audit on council operations and facilities and identify funding and partnership opportunities to achieve the targets. Expand the ICLEI membership to adopt a greenhouse gas emissions reduction target for council buildings and operations and advocate for emissions reduction to the community. The other one was develop an energy use reduction plan for council that includes a greenhouse gas emission abatement target and key action statements to deliver the objectives. So that was pretty overwhelming on 2 days a week. So while the 3 actions talk about targets, there wasn't really a resolution on how we should do that or what they should be. So there was lots of discussions about how to do it, but we didn't actually really get to the bottom of the targets. But we did do the other things around energy, auditing, monitoring, and the energy reduction plan, which I'll talk about now. So after working out what an energy audit actually was, I had a local person perform one, and it was pretty bad. There was some really big errors in his calculations. So I started double checking the information. My eyes then were open to the whole concept of carbon accounting, energy efficiency, payback periods, net present value, new technologies. And then also my job's been much easier because we've got all this aging, outdated infrastructure in our Shire facilities. Much was built in the 90s when energy was cheap and passive design had been replaced with the ideology of bigger and brighter, using as many downlights as you can and more windows. Also, when I first started, council had already set up a subscription with Planet Footprint, so I invested lots of hours mapping the data and making sure the electricity counts were all accounted for and mapped. So we still use Planet Footprint at the basic subscription level, and I use it to verify my own figures. And then also it took about, I reckon, 2 years on 2 days a week, but I finally developed an energy use reduction plan, and it really concentrates on focusing on the top 20 facilities and sites as they represent 80% of our emissions. So this is what we've done, and I'll come back to that in a minute. And then really it's just a bit of a loop. So you set the objectives, have your baseline, prioritise actions, and that's through the energy audits, which also give you an estimate of how much reduction targets you can have, and then you implement the actions, and then you monitor a report, and then it just keeps going around. That's why it's a bit of a journey. So next slide. So yeah, that's just a bit of the strategic background. So we had the environment strategy and those actions, those 3 actions I read out before, and that led to the energy reduction plan. We fed that back into the review of our strategy. So we've done a strategy for 2017, and then that fed into our council plan as well. This is the links to the council plan. I won't spend too much time on that, but in the last council plan, we had the goal to, says our resources are used in a sustainable way. Council will lead by example in the way we use scarce resources. So that's actually been a really good kind of tool to use when we're applying for funding, and also the councillors like that approach as well by leading by example. So yeah, solar is a good easy one. Yeah, and the other goals, our natural assets are maintained and enhanced for future generations, and then that's now fed into our more recent council plan, which is a bit wordier. But in 2013 and 17, yeah, we've also got strategic indicators, and this is what I report against. So when we first did it, I did have a 10% reduction from the baseline because that's what was achievable through our big energy efficiency projects, mainly through the street lighting project. And then I think it really helped not having a target that was really unattainable. And then the risk is that it, you know, if we don't meet it, then we lose all the messaging around the gains that we have made. So each year I report on these targets. These are the strategic indicators, which go into, at the end of the financial year, they go into council's annual report. And I don't know why the 10% target was taken out. So currently in 2017 to 21, it's just reduced council's energy use and greenhouse gas emissions by 2021. But I still use the 2011-12 baseline levels and report against them. So at the time of setting the baseline targets, we also applied for some big energy efficiency funding. We were successful in round 2 of the federal government SEEP program. We put in 3 applications instead of 1 because we separated out the street lighting project from the recreation centres. We didn't want one of them to pull down the other ones, but we were successful with all 3. So we put in a street lighting LED upgrade, energy efficiency to our corporate centre, and our 2 main indoor aquatic centres. This really gave a massive boost to our work and the profile of energy efficiency across our organisation. We're saving big dollars for the organisation. So this is quickly just what we did. The streetlights and corporate centre, we contributed $700,000 to a $1.3 million project. We installed 2,629 LED streetlights to replace the 80-watt mercury vapour lights. We also did a economy cycle on our air conditioning in our corporate centre and LED office lighting all through the corporate centre as well. There's some of the pictures. The one down the bottom is the big air conditioning unit going in. And then this is just the monitoring, really. So this is how I've been monitoring. So the yellow line is when it was all implemented, and then that's the accumulated savings. So it's a little bit out of date. This goes January last year. So by January last year, we'd saved $350,000. That's on the OMR and the electricity charges from swapping to 18-watt LED lights. And Lakes Aquadome, we switched the pool deck lights to LED. We put underbench pool blankets, and we've installed air-sourced heat pumps to change the ratio. We use more electricity and less bottled gas because we were using bottled gas to heat the swimming pool, and that's pretty crazy. We don't have natural gas to Lakes entrance. We put in a new air handling system and boilers, and we had to upgrade the electricity to the site actually because we were using more electricity and less gas. It led to big delays, but it was all worth it. There has been a problem with the air source heat pumps though, because they weren't fit for purpose and they're now corroding. But as you'll see, they've more than paid for themselves with the price of gas going up. So again, the yellow line is the accumulated savings. So, and this is again, it's a year out of date. So by February last year, we'd saved $315,000 just in that site. Then moving on to our indoor swimming pool in Bairnsdale. It's the main swimming pool. So there was over $1.5 million worth of upgrades, and the Shire contributed $420,000. We installed a 65 kilowatt natural gas fired cogen system. There's also LED lighting upgrades to 3 basketball courts, which we also put motion sensors on because before that the swimming pool is located near the high school, so the students would come in the morning, turn the lights on, and they'd just be left on all day. So overall we swapped, and the pool deck lights too. So overall we swapped 103 high bay lights to LEDs. Yeah, and just big heat wheels, as you'll see here, and also a building management system. And you can see from that graph that, yeah, we're saving, like we halved the electricity use there, which is pretty amazing. So again, by January last year, we'd saved $61,000. And a big part of the funding was all around community engagement as well. So we branded the energy efficiency project Bright Futures, which was like straight out of a Utopia episode. My colleague Lester Wharf, he was the project manager, and I was responsible for the communications for these big energy efficiency upgrades. And so I was also, so there was 3 lots of milestone reporting too, which was pretty massive. And there was lots of requirements around reporting and monitoring energy savings. So basically, I have a massive big spreadsheet that includes our top 20 sites And at the end of the financial year, I start populating the figures for these 20 sites. I collect kilowatt hours, gigajoules of natural gas, gigajoules of bottled gas, electricity cost, gas cost, total cost, CO2 emissions, electricity CO2 emissions, total CO2 emissions, total gigajoules. And I've added provisions for like full-time staff members and floor area. And I also keep a record of where the data is sourced from, because sometimes if we swap retailers, like we have been with ERM, and their website's amazing, so you can just run reports. But yeah, I'll put in where I've collected the data and where it's stored, and often I'll just go straight to the gas retailers and request 12 months of data as well. And then I create an annual report. So there's our annual report. Last year's was a 6-page annual report called Emissions, Energy and Water. My intention was for it to be publicly available, but it's not at this stage. So I've kind of made it a bit small and it's a little bit hidden there. We've got a new manager at the moment, an acting manager. So he's working out where the information should go, whether it's just a council briefing or internally to our leadership group. But it just goes through like how many electricity accounts we have. And then, yeah, also we found that the top 35, I've listed the top 35 in the report because they actually accounted for 85% of our electricity, not including streetlights. And then we need to just work out now what level of detail needs to be available and who the audience is really. This is some of it. So it's just the coloured areas on the pie chart outline the parameters in the monitoring. So you, like the yellow is electricity from our emissions. And then fuel and oil. So I use our fleet fuel. We've also got a ferry that goes over to a little island, Raymond Island. So we include the diesel for that. And then streetlights is 18%. And then I only do bottled gas at our Lakes Aquadome because it's too hard to keep track of all our bottled gas accounts. We've got little barbecues everywhere. Yeah, so this is how we're tracking. So you can actually see in the top bar chart that we've reduced 1,200 tonnes just from those big energy efficiency projects so far. And this is also what I report on. So streetlights, bottled gas, mains gas, that's total energy consumption. And then I look at water as well. We've got big caravan parks and gardens, swimming pools. And then back to the community awareness. So this is the community awareness campaign. It's been branded Bright Futures. We also sent students to the energy breakthrough, and they used some of our branding as well. This is the launch with, of the Bright Futures program at our agricultural field days. So we had to see in the background where the people are standing, we've got the number of black balloons for the different street lights. We also did 2 booklets. One's how to make your house energy efficient. So I've put the links there on the screen. And then the other one was more recently funded through VAST, but we tied it all in with the Bright Futures as well. And that's a guide on how to climate-proof your house for floods, storms, bushfires and extreme heat, because they're the top risks facing East Gippsland residents. I've also got websites. And then that trailer we've sent out to lots of our schools and farmers markets and agricultural shows, and it's just independent advice around renewable energy and energy efficiency. So I'm coming near the end. Last year, East Gippsland Shire, the Bright Futures project was recognised for 2 main award ceremonies. We received a special commendation at the recent at the United Nations Association of Australia event, Council was recognised in the Infrastructure Innovation for a Strong Climate Future category of the UN Australia Awards, World Environment Day Climate Action Awards. That was for those big energy efficiency projects. And then this was backed by the Aquatics and Recreation Victoria Awards, where the project won the Sustainability Award for initiatives at the Bairnsdale Aquatic and Rec Centre. The awards recognised, what's been a really successful project for Council. And then also in November last year, Council signed up and took on the Take Two pledge. And we've also installed a lot of solar just on our library. So we've got 2 lots of big solar projects happening now. And then this year we are undertaking, we got some new energy jobs funding. So we're currently running a community solar bulk buy, piloting a solar and energy audit feasibility for local businesses and an energy info hub. And then we'll be doing solar savers and then more solar PV on our libraries. And then this is some other energy efficiency projects. So the process is continuing. We keep doing more energy efficiency and renewable energy projects, and I keep monitoring and reporting on them. The biggest thing now is to report to the community. I've done some annual reports and I've developed my own template, but so far they've only been shown internally. All that's been reported publicly really are the savings from each of the projects and the high level overall strategic indicators of tonnes of CO2 emissions a year, which appear in the Council's annual report. So my plan in the next 12 months is to work more internally to keep selling the messages when we take on new projects and to work closer with our maintenance teams. It'd be great to monitor the community emissions and build their capacity to tackle their own responsibility for their own footprint, because I don't think people do that at all. But it all comes down to resourcing, time and priorities, as you'd all understand. And that's all. Thank you. Thanks for listening.